Hey, happy Monday, everybody. If you have your Bibles, be turning to Luke chapter 18. We're going to be in verses 9 through 15. Sorry for my change of location today, being that it's Martin Luther King Day. My kids and my wife are at home. Usually I record these on my lunch break, so I've kind of got the house to myself. So I'm up in the bedroom trying to avoid the noise and distractions. But we're going to start reading in Luke 18, verse 9. It says, He being Jesus, also told this parable to some who trusted themselves that were righteous and looked down on everybody else. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee was standing and praying like this about himself. God, I thank you that I am not like other people, greedy, unrighteous, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and I give a tenth of everything I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even raise his eyes to heaven, but kept striking his chest, saying, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you this, one went down to his house justified rather than the other, because everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. So this is one of my favorite stories in the entire Bible. I like it because you get a really good understanding for the kind of people that God is after. And looking at it through that prism, you look back at the lineage of Jesus, you look back at the Old Testament, and you look at the first couple chapters of the New Testament, and it's talking about the family line of Jesus. And a lot of times, I know myself, I'm kind of guilty of this, but when you look at family lines, when you look at genealogies, when you look at things like that, it kind of gets to the point where sometimes you just want to skip over those a little bit. But there's some really good lessons to be had in those if you dig deep enough. One lesson, for instance, the family line that makes up Jesus, it's full of losers. And I use that term in the nicest possible way, and we're going to come back to that a little bit because it's interesting that those are the people that God chose to use. And you wonder why that is. And you look back at a guy like Gideon in Judges chapter 6, and God chose this guy to be the leader of a mighty army that was going to take over the land that the Israelites had stolen from them. And Gideon, when he has this encounter with God, he says, God, how can you use me? Not only is my family the weakest in Manasseh, but I'm the weakest in my family. So Gideon's basically saying to God, God, you picked the wrong guy. You picked the weakest of the weak. You picked the lowest of the low. How are you going to use me? And what we go on to learn is that God uses the weak. God uses the losers. God uses the broken because that's who his glory shines in the most. When you think about it, when you're at your weakest point and you think that you can't carry on any longer, sometimes you show that attitude to other people. And sometimes other people are like, man, they're broken. There's not much they can do. And then God uses you in a mighty way, and you're forced to consider the fact that something bigger than that person, something bigger than yourself helped you get through there. And you're not able to lean on yourself. You're not able to be, puff out your chest and to exalt yourself and say, yeah, I did that all by myself. Because you know darn well that you couldn't do it by yourself. You know that you had to have God to help you through. And other people know that you had to have God to help you through. And when you look back at this tax collectors were some of the most despised people in the Roman Empire because they had to pay Caesar the taxes, but whatever they got on top of that was theirs to keep. So, they'd go around double, triple, even quadruple charging people, give Caesar his portion, and then hold the rest back for themselves. So people felt really cheated by the tax collectors, even more so than we do today because there was no rules on what they could collect. If they came by and just said, hey, you owe me like an extra $10,000, you just had to pay it or you were going to jail. So you look at tax collectors and they were despised people. So when you look at it from the point of view of this Pharisee, he walks in, when I think about this guy, he's probably all decked out. He's probably wearing like the nicest clothes. He's probably got this nice worship hat on. And he's up and he's standing and he's got his arms raised and he's like, God, I'm such a great person. Thank you for making me a great person. Thank you for not making me like this guy right here. And you see the guy's response and he's standing kind of far off, and who wouldn't be standing far off? Like, he's getting made fun of by this Pharisee, essentially. And number two, he's despised. He feels despised. He feels like he's not welcome because of his profession, because of what he does. And so he stands off, and what I love about his behavior is it reflects a lot of Old Testament passages that were talking about signs of mourning or signs of humility. Like when he's hitting his chest, the book of Nahum, chapter 2, verse 7 says that's a sign of mourning. People would hit their chests like that whenever they were mourning, whenever they were dealing with a death or dealing with their country being taken over. Jeremiah in Jeremiah chapter 31 does the same thing. He beats his chest whenever he's in mourning. And then you talk about him not looking up. It's a reflection of Psalm chapter 40 verse 12, and it's talking about his burden being so heavy, David in that case, but his burden is so heavy that he can't even bring himself to look anywhere except the ground. And it's talking about it, and then you look at his begging, and it reflects the way that David begged in 2 Samuel chapter 24 when he committed a sin, and he's begging for God's forgiveness. And you look at what this guy's doing, and it's a direct reflection of people who had messed up in the Old Testament. And he's just begging and pleading for God. And this is a mourning. He's reflecting on his sin, and we see how you can handle something like that. You know, when you're most humble, when you're most broken, you know, you've got that idea of your mourning for your sin. And that's what this guy was doing. And when we look back, like I said, God really likes the humble. He likes to take people who are in that broken position and then use them in a mighty way. He's like, okay, get up, dust yourself off. We're going to do something powerful. And when we do something powerful, people are going to know that you didn't do it in your own strength, but that I helped you along the way. So that's the first point I took away, is that God really likes the humble. The second point, this Pharisee is a bad dude. And we think about that and we look about it, and you can kind of trivialize that, and you can look at it from the perspective of, oh man, who would stand up in church like that with their hand raised and say, oh, thank God that you made me such a great person. Thank you that I'm not like this guy. And you know, I'm really guilty of looking at that guy and be like, man, that dude's a jerk. Why would he do that? But think about it and put it into a modern perspective. How many times does somebody grace the door of your church for the first time and you're kind of leery? You're like, I don't know if I want to talk to that person. You know, I don't know if I really feel like showing God's love to that person. You know what I mean? And you get to kind of pick and choose who you show God's love to. You know, and I think a lot of times that leans back on our pride. That leans back on our human nature, and it's like, you know, what can I get out of this interaction? And if it's not something that can bring us, I'm going to use this in quotes, but glory, then we kind of try to avoid it. And when we do that, I don't think we're any better than this Pharisee. And that's going to kind of be my challenge with this devotional this week. It's, you know, put a focus on humility. Put a focus on humbling yourself. Put a focus on being broken. Because when you're in that state, it's when God can really use you the most. You look at this story of this Pharisee and this tax collector. Who did God use in this story? He used the tax collector. He used the guy that was broken. He used the guy that had no other recourse for the sin that he was going through other than to mourn as if it was a death, and to reflect on his life and to not even look up, because that's how broken he was. And when you're that broken, that's when God can really take over. And that's when God can really use you in a mighty and a powerful way and say, look, we're going to do great things together, but I need you to give me the glory. So that's my challenge this week, guys, is to act in humility in everything that you do. To look at everything from the perspective of, how can I handle this in a way that gets me closer to God? Because I think that that's the most important aspect of Christianity, is the fact that we're able to put ourselves aside and we're able to let God shine through us. I say this to my kids all the time. They're probably tired of hearing it, but a phrase is, you might be the only Bible that someone ever reads. And that's a big responsibility, because as Christians, we're to be reflections of Christ's love. We're to show the world how Christ loved us, and to be different and to be an example, so that when people look at us, they're like, what's different about you, and how can I get to that point? So really want to challenge, really want to stress this week, go through everything with a sense of humility and a sense of, how can I use this situation to further my relationship with God? Because even this tax collector laying down and beating his chest and you know, mourning for his sin, even though he was that broken, there was still room for God. And there was room for God to use him in a mighty way. So I think that as Christians today, as soon as we're willing to step aside, as soon as we're willing to humble ourselves, and as soon as we're willing to be broken by God, it's like I talked about the first week. You can wrestle with God, but be ready for God to wrestle back. That's kind of what you're dealing with here. You can open your heart, and you can open your brokenness, and you can open your humility and say, okay, God, I'm ready to be used. But then that's kind of a blessing and a curse, because you've got to be ready to be used at that point. Because when you allow God to take over, when you open up and you let God in, he's going to want to make some changes. He's going to want to do the thing that you're scared to do by yourself. So, again, I've stressed this a few times, but be humble, lives our lives humble, and get ready for what God's ready to do for you. All right, guys, see you next week.